Hello all, Rick here. Spoilers for a lot of Star Trek series, I guess, ahead. But the Borg are overplayed recently, as is the whole concept of evil AI, despite the relevance of such a topic. However, while I do think the Borg should take a backseat for a time, it's important that they do not fade from Star Trek scenes altogether, and never will. Here's why. Star Trek is often about confronting a problem and working to overcome it. Sometimes the theme is purely a moral issue, which leads to great thought experiments and debate. Sometimes the problem is a puzzle in the form of a threatening anomaly that requires a level of clear-headedness and expertise to solve. Occasionally, the problem is another person, or persons, standing in the way of an objective of the crew, or even just being hostile to concepts the United Federation of Planets holds firm. Let's face it, with the addition of B-plots and connected threads of narrative, often Star Trek juggles several of these dilemmas at once. Star Trek has always needed foes to pit the heroes against, ever since its original series days. Hell, most stories do. But these antagonists are seldom depicted as all-out villains because, as is in life, such characters rarely exist. There is always motivation and a story behind an enemy that has brought them to this point in their journey, and while it might not be an agreeable one, extra points to the storyteller if it is one that is at least understandable. The Klingons, for example, to keep it on Star Trek, were introduced in Errand of Mercy to be the antagonists of that episode, and were inspired a lot from Roddenberry's own experiences during the Second World War and anxieties of the time. However, they were presented with ideals and were free-thinking, sentient people with different values than Kirk and Starfleet. This made them less of a combative threat, and indeed, when combat eventually does unfold, the two sides are forced back to the negotiations table by another party. Originally not intended to be returning antagonists, the Klingons would show up again in Trouble with Tribbles, A Private Little War, and Day of the Dove. In each appearance, we gain more insight into Klingon characters and their culture. By the time of Day of the Dove, while not on friendly terms, the episode's entire premise is about putting aside aggression over ideals on revenge and stuff in order to tackle bigger issues. Let's pivot to different antagonists. Cardassians. They are introduced in Next Generation's The Wounded. Within that single episode, we learn that the Cardassians are old enemies of the Federation and that the Border Wars saw characters like Miles O'Brien go through hell. However, we also are presented with viewpoints of characters such as Glyn Darrow, who at least tries to empathise with O'Brien, even if there is too much hurt to overcome in one discussion. Again, the Cardassians may have this strong state-first mentality which allows them to justify all sorts of heinous acts, but they are still individuals, and even in their initial outing, not depicted as some uniformly Machiavellian species. With the emergence of Deep Space Nine, this depth is only heightened with Garak, Zial, Dukat, and even Damar, who are all more complicated characters. So, Star Trek has proven that it enjoys exposing the nuance of its antagonists, and in most cases it does so rather well. In fact, it's an undeniable point that any species capable of independent reason can be brought to discussion, and combat avoided. And when combat is the only recourse, there is usually a motive behind it that can at least be understood. But with the Borg? As Q says on their first introduction, they cannot be bargained with or reasoned, and they are far more powerful than Starfleet. They represent an implacable wall up against which the Sea of Heroes crashes, forcing themselves to evolve to confront a new threat. When introduced, they are simply villains to be beaten, even if more complexity was added with time. The original plan for the Borg was to create a hive-minded insectoid species, of which the alien neural parasites of conspiracy were the initial scouts. However, budget reasons prevented this from being realised, but the inspiration for the foe was maintained. Compassionless foes that move inexorably towards their goals, forcing everything in their way aside while ignoring pleas or attempts at understanding. Between 1988 and 89, the switch was made from organic beings to cyborgs that we know, but their now machine-like logic replaced the alien insectoid drive, but much to the same effect. Of course, eventually the heroes of the tale learn ways to deal with the Borg. uncovering minor vulnerabilities and exploits over time, while building their own armada to confront them, which itself can be seen as a double-edged development. After all, military might and warfare are within Starfleet's purview for sure, but not the focal point of most Star Trek. So there is some merit to the opinion that something like the Borg narratively have no place in Star Trek, a show that prioritises peaceful resolution and an optimistic future. But I would say that that very premise increases the interest in the question of, well, what do the heroes do when faced with a situation where the only course left to them is to fight? We see this at length in Deep Space Nine and the Dominion War. I'd maintain what makes the latter series so engaging is watching these characters we grew to know placed in some of the most desperate situations, watching how Starfleet itself grapples with its principles in order to survive. But additionally, these tales would not be so gratifying without the years of build-up. Wartime Benjamin Sisko is a badass, but we know that is not what he holds dear because we have seen him. Tactical Jean-Luc Picard is exciting to watch, but again, we know what that man would prioritise in life: exploration, preservation of freedoms, knowledge and culture, values shared by Starfleet. The Borg themselves stand as the antithesis to everything Starfleet is by stripping these facets from those who value them, ensuring that beyond a doubt they cannot be reasoned with. Sometimes you need a foe that is not so deep. Sometimes you simply need the monster under the bed, the Orc of Mordor. For variety's sake, if nothing else. Not every foe has to be nuanced with layers of motivation, and while those are certainly my favourite, sometimes the story requires you to bop a foe without dwelling on the fact that that Klingon warrior might have had a family, or that Cardassian might not be making those choices had he not been a part of an oppressive regime. However, this also changes with the Borg, as we learn that they are inevitably recoverable. Those who fell to the collective are victims, and while initially seen as the merciless force of nature, it's not long before Star Trek starts to look at even this seemingly immutable enemy through a new lens. The Best of Both Worlds shows us the trauma that almost every drone must have faced, and the horrifying realisation that they are often still aware. Moving into Voyager, we have 7 of 9, bringing the acclimatisation of individuality and restoration of humanity to a person who formerly could not even conceive of such concepts. But I would say that upon disconnecting a drone from the hive, like Hugh, like 7, they cease to be Borg. To be a Borg is to forego individualism, and when it's restored, you're not a Borg anymore. There is a pathos to be found in studying the collective for sure. The Borg are still this alien malevolence which needs to be combated. Their actions leave for little other choice, yet by doing so, the only entities that get hurt are the victimised creatures in the Borg's thrall. There are some pretty heavy and thought-provoking topics that can be brought to light here, and ample development for characters who have experienced such, which is, in its own way, adding to the narrative potential of the Borg, further showing how much further from their original concept they are now. Again, it's not a bad thing, but I think this is why so much recent sci-fi ends up defaulting to robots, droid armies, and rogue AI as the antagonists, because then it's not a living foe to contend with, and it limits the moral issues of slaying waves of peons. The Borg occupy this space in Star Trek of being both this formidable, unyielding foe and the deeper moral crises faced when battling them. With Starfleet's rise in success at de-assimilating drones and the rise in XBs, those liberated from the collective, we can see another instance of Star Trek taking the bad guy and looking deeper. We even have one instance of a Borg queen going insane and deciding that cooperation is the quicker path to perfection than assimilation, but to my earlier point, she had already gone nuts and basically gave up being a traditional Borg to come to that conclusion. Now, I have no qualms about Star Trek breaking down even the most seemingly alien and deadly opponent to show a deeper side to them. It's Star Trek at its best. And, as an audience observing from the outside, understanding breeds compassion, which is the first step in reaching the most favourable outcomes with the most lives preserved. it gets you thinking, and it makes for engaging storytelling. When introduced, the Borg were there to be the narrative lesson and malevolent threat to the Federation, and while they have not changed, Starfleet, and by extension Star Trek, has. Our heroes learned how to first combat them, to limited success, but more importantly, understand them, and now even actually begin to help them. We see this with so many other Trek aliens, the Klingons, Romulans, Cardassians, and so on. While the Borg are the latest species in Trek to receive this treatment, there will always be a need in fiction for something like their initial depiction. So while I think it is time for Star Trek to ease up on Borg narratives, if not them, then something else will take its place. Although I do tire of the rogue artificial intelligence concept, and I also deeply enjoy more complex villains, be they individuals or hive-minded. But what do you think? Star Trek needs the Borg, or something like them, to be the intractable foe. But even they get deserved development. I say there is still room for both, and this is why Star Trek needs the Borg. Thanks for watching this discussion piece, and let me know what you think. I know these videos can come off as a little less focused than a lore piece, but that's kind of the point. It's more of my opinions and wanting to gauge others' views on the topic. If something I have said here sparks an idea, let me know in the comments, and until the next video, thanks again. I've been Rick, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.